So we've arrived at another Roman settlement. This is Corbridge, or Coria as it was known in the 2nd century. And look at these remains, absolutely incredible. Look at the pillars and the foundations. Incredible. Coria was a thriving town. It wasn't actually on Hadrian's wall. It was built sort of prior to Hadrian's wall, and it was a real sort of cosmopolitan town. They imported things from all over the empire, and it was thriving. These are what would have been the storage for the grains and cereals that were brought into Colbridge. There would have been huge stone warehouses where all the dried food would have been kept. You can see how the thick floor is held up on walls, and there's gaps between the walls to allow air to circulate. And they were designed to sort of keep the food fresh, but also to keep the vermin out. And these walls would have been huge. You can see how they're held up with buttresses. That should give you an idea of how much weight was being held on these walls. And in front here, that what looks like steps is a loading bay. So people would turn up with a cart, he'd pull up at the side here, and he'd unload straight into the warehouse. Fantastic structures, fantastic engineering. And most Roman towns would have had granaries to store the food for the soldiers and the town. Very, very impressive. Granaries would have been an elaborate fountain. You can just see the remains of it here. It must have been fantastic when it was going. You can see the water would have run in at the back, and it would have been here at the front. Just imagine spraying water up in the air. Fantastic. We're looking now along the high street of Coria, and this would have been lined with shops, and this would have been the main thoroughfare through the town. It was an intersection of roads here. A road called Staingate ran west to Carlisle from here. So you can see it's a fantastic place. But this is the high street. You can see the buildings that would have been, lining the main road through the town, and you can imagine loads of people sort of jostling the marketplace, going into different shops, buying new things, looking at the traders, seeing what they had for sale. Yeah, you can just imagine it. It's not hard to imagine what it must have been like walking down here in the 2nd century Britain. You can imagine the fishmongers calling, the smells of the butchers, the fruit, vegetables, people shouting, children playing, just like any other high street in a town, I suppose. And like most towns, you get the ribbon development along the roads, which is what you got here. Look at that. That is incredible. Can you imagine how big that building must have been? So what we're looking at here is what they think is the barracks and officers' quarters of the soldiers that were stationed at Corbridge. There were 2 detachments of legionaries. One was the 20th Legion, the Valeria Victrix, which means valiant and victorious, and the other was the 2nd Legion Augusta, which means majestic. And they'd have been stationed here at Coria just to keep the peace, and sort of extra troops on the wall if they were needed. We're standing in front of what would have been originally a huge courtyard, and it began to be built towards the end of the 2nd century, which was when the person behind the skull was alive. So maybe he came and saw this courtyard. It was at the time probably the biggest in Roman Britain, And just the size of it, you know, tells us how much investment was being put into Courtbridge as a town. It must have been huge, phenomenally huge. Look at the size of those blocks. It's massive. You can imagine big pillars holding a roof up. People bustling about. But the building was never finished. So whether the money ran out or they had a change of heart, who knows? But it's only the foundations that are left. But you can imagine it must have been a huge undertaking. Looking at the courtyard from a different angle, you can see the quality of the stonework. The stonemasons must have been incredibly skillful people. Each one of these was hand cut and brought on site either by, I don't know, horse and cart, mules or slaves. Just these rocks here must weigh a ton. And then you think there's 2 courses here. On the other side there's 3 courses. They may have gone up to 10 courses high. This is the opposite side of the courtyard. And you can see the skill, the intricacy of these stones. There's hardly enough room to get a piece of paper between those joints. They are butted up perfectly. Oh, and if anybody's interested, this little plant here is called self-heal, Prunella vulgaris, and this would have been around when the Romans were here. It's a beautiful little purple flower. Self-heal, just growing in the middle of the rocks. It's probably a little bit warmer down there, a bit more sheltered. If you look under the stones, not only are they hand cut, they've got a curve on them as well. You can see the curve on the outside. But there's also a channel cut underneath. You can see down here for the running water. It's incredible. Certainly very humbling to see something of this sort of magnitude and this skill. You know, 2,000 years ago, we sort of imagine people being primitive and not very intelligent, but these are just fantastic. The skill is just mind-blowing. They must have used quite complex scaffolding, block and tackles, I would imagine, to get these up. I bet each one of these, it must weigh a ton at least. Those are huge pieces of stone, and like I say, each one is cut exactly to fit together. And there you can see at the bottom there, you've got your foundations, the round sort of pebbles. So not only what you see on top, there's also work underneath. Now if you listen carefully, this bird you'll hear is a yellowhammer. And it sounds like it's saying a little bit of bread and no cheese. A little bit of bread and no cheese. See if we'll do it again. There you go. Not. In this field was a huge Roman house that they think was one of the biggest on the frontier. And it was very, very ornately decorated. But Courtbridge was a frontier town, but it was also a meeting of lots of roads, was Staingate and Deer Street. So, you know, you could get to York in just a few days of walking. So it was quite a centre of business and commerce, and also a centre for military activity. You could get anywhere along Hadrian's Wall from here. You could get east and west, you could go south, you could also go north across the wall. So it was an important place. Here would have been the most sacred building on the site. It was the headquarters of the 2nd Legion Augusta. So the barracks were here, and these were the headquarters. And this is where the eagles of the Legion would have been kept. This is where all the documentation for the legionaries, the auxiliaries, would have been kept. And this here would have been the strong room. and this is where all the legionaries' wages and pay and savings would have been kept. The eagles would have been kept here, and it would have been under constant guard. It's fascinating to think that there would have been 2 armed legionaries stood at the top of those steps, day in, day out, night and day, you know, guarding sort of the inner sanctum of the legion, and the bustle of the officers sorting out who was on guard duty and who was going on leave and who was ill and who was missing and who'd done something wrong, and sorting out punishments. Yeah, just turn your mind back 2,000 years and it's all here. I wonder what this structure was for. It's arch shaped. I wonder if it was for sort of rainwater runoff, like drainage. I don't know. It's interesting. Fantastic place. It's just incredible that the foundations that remain. Now, if you think the person who the skull belonged to may have lived in one of these towns, you know, 2,000 years ago, he or she may have been a soldier, may have been a trader, may have been a townsperson. We'll never know. But it's nice to imagine. It's nice to sort of think that's maybe what he was. Or maybe he was one of the tribesmen that was fighting the Romans. Maybe he was one of the people that, you know, the townsfolk were terrified of. We'll never know. But it's nice to imagine. Can you imagine what it must have been like for the native Britons to have something this huge and this permanent being built in your back garden? For people who were living in sort of wattle and daub huts and in small sort of enclosure camps, this must have seemed incredible. It must have been hard for them to believe that things like this could have been made. It was built with a permanence. You can see that with the craftsmanship that's gone into it. These buildings weren't going anywhere. This was settlement, and it must have terrified the locals. Here's something to ponder. When our person was alive, the Romans had sanitation, they had running water, they had sewage systems, they had baths, they had underfloor heating, they had saunas. And then you jump forward, say, 500 years to sort of, 15th, 16th century. How bad sanitation and running water was. It's sort of the Victorian era when people started to get their head around sewerage and sanitation. So things almost went backwards after the Romans left. And it took an awfully long time before things got to the level that the Romans had. This is the Colbridge Hoard. You can see here some of the lorica segmentata armour. So the overlapping metal. Fantastic finds. Don't think we'll find many of these on the foreshore, but who knows? They're there to be found. Just looking at some of the weapons that they use. These are the tips off the spears. And these strange things here are called caltrops, and they were used to slow down cavalry. And the idea was, whichever way you threw them, a spike would be upright, and that would stick into the frog of the horse, the soft part of the horse's foot. We're going to go into the Clayton Museum now. Wow. Wow. This is fantastic. And all these were found on the site of the fort. There you go, a bit of Roman graffiti. The century of Caecilius Monimus built this. So you can see here, that was the 6th cohort and the 9th cohort. Not sure about this one, but it was Flavius Civilis. And this is the century of the senior centurion. Fantastic. And to think these would have been made when the person who the skull belonged to was still alive. It's incredible to think that maybe he was in one of these cohorts. Who knows? These artifacts are incredible. Fantastic. 2,000 years old. It's just mind-blowing to think that people made them and wrote the names in them. And like I say, who knows? You know, the man who the skull belonged to, he could have made these. He was certainly alive when these stones were being carved. These huge things here are milestone markers, and each one has a dedication. It's incredible. Just look as I pan round how many artifacts there are in here. It is just chock-a-block. Look at that. It's just wall to ceiling of stones and artifacts. What a fantastic place. You can just feel the history. It's sort of oozing out of the place. Fantastic. If you get the chance to visit this area, you must come. It's just incredible. So this is the headquarters building, and it would have contained the strong room where the soldiers' wages were kept. There'd be a shrine, the officer's office, a hallway, a tribunal area, a courtyard, and strangely enough, a phallic symbol, as well as the well that you can see there in the foreground. It's an amazing place. This was in someone's backyard, and the Claytons owned all this land, and he did a lot of the excavation himself, and he uncovered a lot of what we can see now. But can you imagine having this in your back garden? This chamber is the strong room where the soldiers' wages would have been kept. And Bramble, go on Bramble, she's going to take us down. Come on, I don't know. Here she comes. Here we are. This is the strong room. We're inside it now. You can see the stairs going out and the arched roof. Fantastic. It's hard to believe these structures are 2,000 years old, isn't it, Bramble? Yeah. They look like they were built maybe 20 years ago. Certainly not 2,000. What do you think, Bramble? Are you impressed? So you can see here, these would have been the pillars underneath the floor that would have circulated the warm air that would have heated the buildings. You can see it better here. They've still got the slabs on top. Fantastic feats of engineering. Look at that. Incredible. It's hard to imagine that the person the skull belonged to was alive when all this was being built. And I know probably it didn't happen, but who knows, he might have visited here. What an incredible thought that is. I think these red tiles are called Hippocos tiles, and these were part of the underfloor heating system. So as you can see, this is a commandant's house, and if we just look over this wall here, fantastic example of the underfloor heating. Those are the Hippocos tiles, and underneath there would have circulated warm air that would have kept his house nice and warm. So this would have been the east gate, and this would have been one of the entrances to the fort. You can see the stone, it's all hand cut, all fitted in together. You can see in the distance there the River Tyne just meandering along, and this would have been protecting the crossing for travellers and traders and soldiers. This is another fort in the perimeter. It's hard looking at them now to imagine how high they were. They were much taller than this, maybe 20-30 feet high. So when you look at this, there's probably been different layers, different floors that the men would have lived on. But you can see there, I've just walked from, that's the angle tower, and we've come down following the perimeter to the interval tower. So we're looking at another of the entrance gates. You can see from the picture I just showed, we're looking out to where the vicus would have been. So all these fields in front of us here would have been a town that existed because of the fort. But that hasn't been excavated yet, so who knows what lies beneath these fields that we're looking at. But it must have been an amazing sight. I suppose one fed off the other. The vicus provided supplies to the fort, and the fort supplied money to the vicus. Incredible. It must have been hard being a Roman, living on the edge of the empire, especially if someone's been recruited from somewhere like Syria or Spain, where it's normally hot. We're here in June and it is absolutely freezing. We're wrapped up like it's winter. The wind's icy, it's overcast, it was raining all morning. For summer it's just a nightmare, so you can imagine a Roman sentry stood in this tower just looking out thinking, what have I done to deserve this? You know, in the middle of summer now, it's bitterly cold, so what it must have been like 2,000 years ago, I can't imagine. We've walked around the perimeter now, we've come to the west gate, and I'm just wondering whether those two horses would have made good cavalry horses. Don't know, they look strong I suppose, I don't know what Roman horses would have looked like, whether they would have been the same as modern horses or whether they'd been smaller, larger, not sure.